The Galactic Council had heard whispers of humanity for over 3 centuries. In the sprawling archives of Kepler Station, tucked away between reports of failed mining operations and trade disputes, lay a single file marked Species 7749H, unconfirmed. The contents read like a children's tale, stories of bipedal creatures from a backwater system who supposedly possessed an inexplicable drive to overcome impossible odds. Most council members who bothered to read it at all dismissed it as the fevered imagination of deep space explorers gone mad from isolation. Ambassador Thexnar of the Vreldian hegemony was no exception. A pragmatic being whose crystalline exoskeleton had weathered 4 centuries of diplomatic service, he regarded such tales with the same skepticism he reserved for reports of ghost ships and temporal anomalies. The universe, in his experience, operated on predictable principles. Strong species conquered weak ones. Advanced civilizations absorbed primitive ones. Technology determined hierarchy. These were the immutable laws that had governed galactic society since the first interstellar government formed 8 millennia ago. On the morning that would shatter these assumptions, Thexnar sat in his climate-controlled office aboard the hegemony's flagship, the Inexorable Tide, reviewing territorial claims in the outer spiral. His species had evolved on a world where strength meant survival, where the weak were either absorbed by the strong or left to perish in the planet's harsh crystal caves. This philosophy had served them well in their rise to become one of the Council's 3 dominant powers, alongside the technologically superior Zentari Collective and the militaristic Korthak Empire. The first indication that this day would be different came in the form of a priority transmission from Deep Space Monitor Station Gamma 7, positioned at the edge of what they called the Empty Quarter, a region of space notable only for its lack of habitable worlds and strategic resources. The message was brief and, to Thexnar's mind, likely the result of equipment malfunction. Unidentified vessel detected. Configuration unknown. Approach vector suggests origin from uncharted system. Requesting instructions. Thexnar's aide, a young Vreldian named Klex, trembled slightly as he delivered the message. Sir, the monitoring station reports the vessel appears to be primitive. Pre-FTL drive signatures, but somehow maintaining velocities that should be impossible for such technology. The ambassador's multifaceted eyes shifted to regard his subordinate. Explain. The ship appears to be using chemical propulsion, sir, but it's moving at nearly 40% light speed. Our scientists believe this should be impossible without either destroying the vessel or its occupants. For a moment, Thexnar felt a flutter of something he hadn't experienced in decades: curiosity. He had seen the rise and fall of dozens of species, watched as primitive civilizations either adapted to galactic society or were absorbed by it. But this was unprecedented. No species had ever achieved such velocities without mastering the fundamental technologies that the Council considered prerequisites for space travel. Deploy a reconnaissance squadron, he ordered. I want to know what we're dealing with. The squadron that responded consisted of 3 ships from the Council's most elite force: the Sovereign's Will, the Endless Reach, and the Final Argument. Each vessel represented centuries of technological advancement, equipped with weapons capable of cracking planets and shields that had never been breached. Their crews were veterans of a dozen conflicts, beings who had served with distinction in the pacification campaigns that had brought order to the galaxy's more unruly sectors. Captain Zethmer of the Sovereign's Will had personally overseen the integration of 47 species into the Council's protective embrace. His record was impeccable. Every encounter had ended with either immediate surrender or swift, decisive victory. As his ship's sensors locked onto the approaching vessel, he felt the familiar confidence that came with overwhelming technological superiority. Analysis complete, Captain, his tactical officer reported. The vessel appears to be constructed primarily of refined metals: steel, titanium, aluminum composites, primitive fusion reactors for power, no energy shielding detected, no recognizable weapon systems. Length approximately 800 meters. Estimated crew complement, uncertain. The vessel's internal structure is unlike anything in our databases. Zethmore studied the tactical display with growing confusion. The ship before them looked like something from a museum, a crude amalgamation of metal plates and primitive propulsion systems that belonged to the early space age of any developing civilization. Yet the energy readings told a different story. The vessel was generating power levels that should have been impossible for fusion technology, and somehow channeling that energy in ways that defied conventional physics. Hail them, he ordered. The response came immediately. transmitted on multiple frequencies simultaneously in what appeared to be dozens of different languages and mathematical formulas. The Universal Translator, a marvel of Zen-3 engineering capable of passing any known form of communication, struggled for several minutes before producing a partial translation. Unknown vessels, this is the UES Resilience. We come in peace, seeking dialogue with representatives of galactic civilization. We have come a very long way to have this conversation. The voice that emerged from the translator was unlike anything in Zethmore's experience. Most species, when first encountering the Council's overwhelming power, spoke with either reverence or terror. This voice carried neither. Instead, there was something else. A quality that the captain couldn't immediately identify, but that made his combat instincts stir uneasily. Primitive vessel, you have entered Council-controlled space without authorization. Reduce velocity and prepare to be boarded for processing. The response came after a brief pause. We appreciate the welcome, Captain. However, we're not slowing down. We have an appointment to keep. On the bridge of the Sovereign's will, silence fell like a physical weight. Zethmore stared at the communication display, certain he had misheard. In 4 centuries of service, no species had ever refused a Council directive. The very concept was so foreign that his ship's computer flagged the response as a probable translation error. Repeat your last transmission, unknown vessel. You heard correctly, Captain. We're continuing on our current course. We've come to speak with your leaders, and we intend to do exactly that. We'd prefer to do it peacefully, but we're prepared for other possibilities. The tactical officer's voice cracked slightly as he spoke. Sir, they're actually accelerating. Current velocity 42% light speed and climbing. Zethmore felt the first stirring of something he hadn't experienced in decades. Doubt. This wasn't how first contact was supposed to proceed. Primitive species were supposed to be awed by the Council's power, grateful for the opportunity to join galactic civilization under proper guidance. They weren't supposed to make demands and ignore lawful orders from vessels that could reduce their homeworld to cosmic dust. Deploy interdiction field. Bring them to a full stop. The interdiction field was a marvel of Korthak military engineering, a localized distortion of spacetime that made faster-than-light travel impossible and could slow even sublight vessels to manageable velocities. It had never failed to stop a ship regardless of size or technology level. The field generators hummed to life, sending invisible waves of twisted space toward the approaching vessel. The human ship flew through the interdiction field as if it didn't exist. Impossible, breathed the tactical officer. The field is operating at maximum efficiency. They should have been stopped completely. Zethmore stared at his displays, watching the primitive vessel continue its relentless approach. Everything he understood about physics, about the natural order of the universe, said this couldn't be happening. Yet there it was, a ship that by all rights should have been a floating museum piece, casually ignoring technology that had taken the Council's greatest minds centuries to develop. Sir, his communications officer called out, we're receiving another transmission from the human vessel. Put it through. The same voice emerged from the speakers, calm and conversational despite the impossible situation. We noticed you tried to stop us. We appreciate the concern, but we're fine. Our navigation systems are quite reliable. However, we should probably explain something before this goes any further. A new display materialized in the center of the bridge, not transmitted by the Council ship's systems, but somehow projected directly by the approaching vessel. The image showed a star chart of the local region with the positions of all 3 Council ships marked precisely. We know exactly where you are, what weapons you're carrying, and what you're probably thinking right now, the human voice continued. We know about the reinforcements you called for 17 minutes ago. We know about the battle fleet massing at Kepler Station. We know about the emergency session of the Galactic Council scheduled for tomorrow morning. The communications officer's hands trembled as he checked his boards. Sir, we never sent word to Kepler Station. The message to Fleet Command was encoded with our highest level encryption. We also know, the human voice continued, that you're trying to understand how a primitive species could possibly possess this level of capability. The answer is simpler than you might think. We've had a lot of practice at doing impossible things. Captain Zethmore had fought in 7 major conflicts and dozens of smaller ones. He had faced overwhelming odds, technological disadvantages, and opponents who seemed to hold every advantage. But he had never felt the cold touch of genuine fear that now crept up his spine as he stared at the approaching human vessel. This is impossible, he murmured. No, Captain, came the reply. as if the humans could somehow hear his words despite closed communication channels. Impossible was leaving our homeworld in a ship held together with determination and salvaged metal. Impossible was crossing 47 light-years in a vessel that shouldn't have been able to reach our own moon. Impossible was doing it with a crew that had never seen the stars except through telescopes. The image in the center of the bridge changed, showing what appeared to be Earth, a blue and white marble suspended against the black of space. But this wasn't the pristine world that might be expected of a species with humanity's apparent capabilities. The planet showed scars, massive craters, dead zones where no lights shone, and orbital debris that spoke of terrible conflicts. "We didn't come looking for a fight," the human voice continued. "We came because we learned something that we thought you should know. Something about what's coming for all of us, council species and humans alike." Ambassador Fexnar, monitoring the encounter from the inexorable tide, felt his crystalline structure vibrate with barely contained energy. His species' evolutionary response to stress was to become more rigid, more structured, but the paradoxes presented by this encounter threatened to shatter his fundamental understanding of reality. "What do they mean? What's coming?" he demanded of his intelligence staff. His chief analyst, a Xanthari whose cybernetic implants linked her directly to the collective's vast databases, paused in her calculations. "Sir, there are no references in Council records to any external threats. The galaxy has been stable for over 2 millennia. But even as she spoke, new data streams were flowing across her consciousness, fragments of information that made no sense according to accepted models of galactic sociology. Reports of missing ships at the edge of Council space, unexplained energy signatures detected by deep space monitors, and now, threading through it all, the impossible presence of a species that shouldn't exist. Speaking of threats that hadn't been detected, the human vessel continued its approach, now close enough for detailed visual analysis. What the Council ship saw defied every assumption about primitive technology. The hull of the Resilience was indeed made of crude metals, but those metals had been shaped and fitted with a precision that suggested manufacturing capabilities beyond anything in Council databases. More disturbing were the modifications. Sections of the ship that had clearly been rebuilt, sometimes multiple times with whatever materials had been available. It was a ship that told a story of desperation, ingenuity, and an absolute refusal to accept defeat. Every plate, every weld, every jury-rig system spoke of beings who had faced impossible challenges and found ways to overcome them through sheer determination and innovative thinking. "Captain," the tactical officer reported, his voice tight with stress, "I'm detecting massive energy buildups throughout the human vessel." "But the patterns, they don't match any known weapon systems." "Then what are they?" "Unknown, sir. The energy flows seem to be adaptive, like the ship is reconfiguring itself in real time." On the bridge of the Resilience, Commander Sarah Chen stood before a display showing the 3 Council ships arrayed against them. At 43, she had never expected to see the stars, let alone find herself representing humanity in its first contact with galactic civilization. Her path to this moment had been carved through decades of loss, struggle, and the kind of choices that left permanent marks on the soul. "Engine status?" she asked quietly. "Holding steady at 44% light speed," replied her chief engineer, a man whose prosthetic arms were more machine than flesh after years of jury-rigging systems that were never meant to work together. "The fusion cores are running hot but within acceptable parameters. We've got maybe 6 hours before we need to shut down for maintenance." Chen nodded. 6 hours to convince the most powerful civilization in the galaxy that humanity deserved to exist. 6 hours to explain why Earth's children had built a ship from salvage and dreams, then flung themselves into the void on a mission that should have been suicide. "Communications, open a channel to all 3 ships, full broadcast." A communications officer, a young woman whose family had died in the siege of New Geneva, looked up from her console. "Channel open, Commander." Chen took a breath, feeling the weight of her species' future settling on her shoulders. When she spoke, her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had learned to lead not through birthright or appointment, but through the simple necessity of keeping people alive when everything else had failed. "Council vessels, this is Commander Sarah Chen of the United Earthship Resilience. We know this isn't how first contact is supposed to work. We know we're violating your protocols and probably scaring the hell out of you. But we need you to understand something before this goes any further." She paused, looking at the tactical display showing the massive ships arrayed against them. Each one represented technology so advanced, that a single vessel could likely sterilize Earth's entire surface. But fear was a luxury they couldn't afford. 47 years ago, we made contact with something that shouldn't exist. Something that came from between the galaxies, from places where stars died long before our sun was born. We tried to fight it alone. We lost. We lost badly. The bridge fell silent except for the hum of overcharged engines and the whisper of recycled air. Every person aboard the Resilience carried scars from humanity's first brush with extinction. They were the survivors of a war that had reduced Earth's population from 8 billion to less than 100 million. The remnants of a species that had looked into the abyss and somehow found the strength to look back. What we discovered, Chen continued, is that this threat isn't gone. It's waiting, it's learning, and it's coming for all of us. Human, Vreldian, Xanthari, Korthak, every species in this galaxy. We came here not as conquerors or supplicants, but as the bearers of a warning. On the bridge of the Sovereign's will, Captain Zethmore struggled to process what he was hearing. The universe he had known, the ordered galaxy of the Council, was built on the foundation of superior technology and established hierarchy. But here was a species that had faced something the Council had never even detected, something that had nearly destroyed them, and they had somehow survived to cross impossible distances and deliver a warning to civilizations they had never met. "Sir," his tactical officer whispered, "long-range sensors are detecting energy signatures at the edge of the system. Multiple contacts. Unknown configuration." Zethmore's blood ran cold. "How many?" "Uncertain, sir. The signals are strange. They don't match any known propulsion systems." The human voice continued its transmission, now addressing not just the 3 ships before them, but, somehow, the entire Council fleet that was rushing toward this confrontation. "We know you have questions about who we are, what we're capable of, why we're here. The answers are simpler than you think, but they're going to challenge everything you believe about survival, about strength, about what it means to face extinction and choose to keep fighting." Commander Chen looked around her bridge, at the faces of men and women who had given everything to make this moment possible. They were scarred, augmented, held together by determination and medical technology that was crude by galactic standards, but had somehow kept them alive when more advanced civilizations might have fallen. "The truth is," she said, her words carrying across space to ships whose crews were struggling to understand how their ordered universe had suddenly become so complicated. "We didn't come here because we're strong. We came because we learned how to be strong. We learned it in the ruins of our cities, in the depths of space when our engines failed and we had to rebuild them with nothing but scrap metal and hope. We learned it when we buried half our species and then picked up their tools to continue their work." The energy readings from the human ship spiked again, but not in preparation for attack. Instead, the Resilience began transmitting data, terabytes of information that painted a picture of humanity's recent history in devastating detail. Images of Earth's scarred surface. Technical specifications of weapons that had failed against an enemy the Council had never imagined. And, most disturbing of all, projections of what would happen when that enemy turned its attention to the thriving civilizations of the galactic core. "This is what's coming," Chen's voice continued. "Not today, not tomorrow, but soon. And when it arrives, it won't care about our political structures or our territorial claims or our technological hierarchies. It will see us all as we saw our first cities when we were children, things to be knocked down and forgotten." Ambassador Thexnar stared at the data streams flowing across his displays, his crystalline mind struggling to process implications that threatened to shatter everything he had believed about the nature of the universe. The images showed destruction on a scale that defied comprehension. Entire continents reduced to ash, orbital installations torn apart by weapons that seemed to violate the fundamental laws of physics, and through it all, the desperate struggle of a species that refused to accept extinction. "Sir," his aide whispered, "preliminary analysis of the human data suggests technological capabilities consistent with late-stage galactic civilization, but implemented using principles we don't recognize." "How is that possible?" "Unknown, sir. But the mathematical proofs appear to be valid." "They've achieved faster-than-light capability through methods that our scientists haven't considered." The truth was beginning to dawn on Thexnar, a realization that struck at the heart of everything the Council represented. They weren't dealing with a primitive species that had somehow stumbled upon advanced technology. They were dealing with a civilization that had developed along entirely different lines, one that had faced challenges the Council had never imagined. and found solutions through paths that established galactic science had deemed impossible. The question before us now, Commander Chen continued, isn't whether we can coexist, it's whether we can work together to survive what's coming. Because the enemy that nearly destroyed us isn't gone. It's out there, in the dark between galaxies, and it's been studying us all. Part 2. The Strength That Cannot Be Broken. The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened 18 hours after the human ship entered council space, though the term session hardly captured the chaos that erupted when representatives from 47 species gathered in the Great Hall of Kepler Station. The Resilience held position at the edge of the system, maintaining its impossible velocity while surrounded by the largest fleet assembled in over a millennium. Ambassador Thexnar found himself at the center of a storm of accusations, demands, and barely contained panic. The Zentari demanded immediate action to contain what they termed a technological contamination event. The Korthak military representative insisted that the human vessel represented a clear threat to galactic security and should be destroyed before it could corrupt Council databases with its impossible capabilities. The smaller species, those who had joined the Council through conquest or absorption, whispered among themselves about what this development might mean for the established order. But beneath the political maneuvering and species rivalry, a deeper concern gnawed at every representative present. The data transmitted by the human ship had been analyzed by the finest minds in known space, and the conclusions were inescapable. Humanity had faced something that shouldn't exist, and somehow survived. Fleet Admiral Korkthal of the Korthak Empire stood before the assembly, his battle-scarred exoskeleton gleaming under the chamber's lights. His species had built their society on the principle that strength determined survival, that the weak existed only at the sufferance of the strong. The human ship's very existence challenged these fundamental beliefs. The primitive vessel maintains course despite the deployment of our most advanced interdiction systems, he reported, his voice carrying the weight of military authority. Current projections suggest it will reach the core worlds within 72 hours unless stopped by direct intervention. And what form would this intervention take? Asked Chancellor Vexnari of the Zentari Collective, her cybernetic implants flickering with data streams. Our preliminary analysis suggests that conventional weapons may prove ineffective. The admission hung in the chamber like a physical presence. The Korthak military had never met a challenge it couldn't overcome through superior firepower, and the Zentari had never encountered a technology they couldn't analyze and duplicate. Yet here was a single ship from a species they'd never heard of, casually ignoring their best efforts to stop it. Perhaps, suggested Ambassador Thexnar, we should consider what the humans are actually trying to tell us. The suggestion was met with a mixture of scorn and disbelief. The idea that a primitive species might have information valuable to the Council struck many representatives as absurd, but Thexnar had spent the long hours since first contact reviewing the human data transmissions, and what he'd found there defied every assumption about technological development and survival. The human ship isn't just primitive technology made to work, he continued. It's something entirely new. They've developed capabilities that our science says should be impossible, using methods that violate established principles of physics. Impossible, growled Admiral Korkthal. No species develops advanced technology without following recognized pathways. There are natural laws, logical progressions. Are there? Thexnar activated a holographic display showing the technical specifications of the Resilience. Look at their propulsion system. They're using controlled fusion reactions but channeling the energy through crystalline matrices that shouldn't be able to handle those power levels. Their hull is made of primitive metals but arranged in structural patterns that provide strength characteristics equivalent to our most advanced composites. Chancellor Vexnari's implants hummed as she processed the data. The mathematical models supporting these designs, they're based on principles we haven't discovered, or rather, principles we discarded as impossible during our early development phases. Which brings us to the central question, Thexnar said. How does a species develop these capabilities, and why are they so certain that we need to hear what they have to say? The answer came from an unexpected source. Lefnar, a Vareldian xenobiologist whose specialty was the study of species adaptation and survival, had been quietly analyzing the biological data included in the human transmissions. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of scientific authority. I believe I understand what we're dealing with. The humans aren't following normal technological development patterns because they haven't had the luxury of normal development. According to their historical records, they've faced 7 major extinction events in the last 50,000 years. Each time, they've been reduced to small populations, sometimes numbering in the thousands, and forced to rebuild from virtually nothing. The chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. Most council species had developed in relatively stable environments, building their civilizations through gradual technological advancement and territorial expansion. The concept of repeated near-extinction followed by recovery was alien to their experience. "But that should have made them weaker," protested a representative from one of the minor species. "Repeated population bottlenecks should have reduced their genetic diversity, their technological base. Under normal circumstances, yes," Dr. Lethnar agreed. "But humans appear to have developed a unique response to existential threats. They don't just adapt, they innovate. When faced with challenges that should destroy them, they find new solutions, often by combining existing technologies in ways that shouldn't work but somehow do." The holographic display changed, showing images of Earth's surface taken during humanity's recent conflict with the unknown enemy. The devastation was comprehensive. Cities reduced to molten slag, continents scarred by weapons that had burned through the planet's crust. But scattered throughout the destruction were signs of something else. Structures that had been built, destroyed, and rebuilt multiple times, each iteration showing improvements and adaptations. "They call it adaptive engineering," Lethnar continued. "The practice of developing technology not for optimal conditions but for the worst possible scenarios. Every human system is designed with the assumption that it will be damaged, destroyed, or cut off from support. As a result, their equipment doesn't just function, it continues to function under conditions that would cripple our most advanced systems." Admiral Corksthal studied the images with growing unease. His military mind could appreciate the implications of technology designed for survival rather than dominance. This explains their ship's capabilities. It's not advanced technology, it's technology designed to work when everything else fails. More than that, Chancellor Vexnari added, her implants processing vast streams of data, their social structure appears to be built around the same principle. They don't have traditional hierarchies based on genetic superiority or technological advancement. Their leadership emerges from demonstrated ability to keep communities alive under impossible conditions. The revelation struck at the heart of galactic society. Every council species had built their civilization on some form of hierarchical structure: strength, intelligence, technological advancement, or simple age and tradition. The humans seem to have developed something entirely different, a society based on collective survival and mutual support. This is why they're not afraid of us, Vexnar realized. It's not arrogance or ignorance. They've faced worse threats than we represent and found ways to survive them. Before anyone could respond, the chamber's communication systems activated, carrying a transmission from the human ship. Commander Chen's voice filled the Great Hall, calm and professional despite addressing the combined leadership of galactic civilization. "Council representatives, we've been monitoring your discussions. We appreciate that our arrival has created considerable confusion, and we regret any disruption to your normal procedures. However, we need to address some misconceptions that seem to be developing. The audacity of eavesdropping on the Council's most secure communications should have been impossible. The Chamber's shielding was designed to prevent any unauthorized monitoring, using technology that the Zenthari had spent centuries perfecting. Yet somehow the humans were listening in as if the barriers didn't exist. We're not here to threaten your civilization or challenge your authority," Chen continued. "We're here because we've learned something that affects all of us, and we've run out of time for conventional diplomatic approaches." A new display materialized in the center of the chamber, not projected by council systems, but somehow imposed directly by the human ship. The image showed the galaxy itself, but with additions that made every representative's blood run cold. Dark shapes moved between the spiral arms, vast structures that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. 47 years ago, we detected anomalous signals from outside the galactic disk, Chen's voice explained. Our initial assumption was that we'd discovered another civilization, perhaps one more advanced than our own. We were excited by the prospect of first contact. The image zoomed in on one of the dark shapes, revealing details that defied comprehension. It wasn't a ship in any recognizable sense. It was a construct the size of a small moon, its surface covered in geometric patterns that seemed to shift and change even as they watched. More disturbing were the smaller objects surrounding it, debris fields that resolved into the recognizable remains of spacecraft. "First contact did not go as we hoped," Chen continued with characteristic understatement. The entity we encountered didn't communicate in any way we could understand. It didn't negotiate, demand surrender, or show any interest in our culture or technology. It simply began converting our outer colonies into something else. The images that followed painted a picture of horror beyond anything in council records. Human colonies transformed into geometric patterns of crystalline growth. Ships captured and restructured into forms that served unknown purposes. And through it all, the relentless advance of entities that seemed to regard organic life as nothing more than raw material for their incomprehensible projects. We fought. Chen's voice carried the weight of memory and loss. We fought with everything we had: nuclear weapons, antimatter charges, kinetic bombardment, biological warfare. Nothing made any difference. The entities absorbed our attacks, learned from them, and incorporated our own weapons into their structures. Admiral Corksthal leaned forward, his military instincts engaged despite the impossibility of what he was seeing. How many did you lose? In the first phase of the conflict, we lost 37 colonies and approximately 2 billion people. Our space fleet was reduced from 400 ships to 12. Earth's population dropped by 60% as we evacuated people from surface cities to underground bunkers. The numbers were staggering, representing losses that would have broken most species. But the humans were still here, still fighting, still finding ways to survive. The breakthrough came when we stopped trying to destroy them and started trying to understand them, Chen continued. We realized that the entities weren't malevolent in any sense we could comprehend. They were purposeful. They had a goal that transcended individual survival or territorial expansion. Dr. Lathner found his voice. What kind of goal? They're preparing for something. Converting organic matter and conventional technology into structures designed to survive, we're not sure what. Our best theories suggest they're preparing for some kind of cosmic event, something that will affect the entire local galactic group. The implications hit every representative simultaneously. If the humans were correct, then the entities weren't just a threat to one species or even one civilization. They represented a danger to every form of life in the galaxy. How did you survive? Chancellor Vexnari asked, her implants working furiously to process the tactical data embedded in the human transmissions. We learned to think like them, Chen replied, not in terms of conquest or defense, but in terms of adaptation and survival. We stopped building technology designed to win battles and started building technology designed to keep us alive no matter what happened. The chamber's display showed the evolution of human technology over the 4 decades since first contact with the entities. Ship designs that prioritized redundancy over efficiency. Weapon systems that could be rapidly reconfigured for different threats. Colonies built deep underground and designed to be completely self-sufficient for centuries at a time. Most importantly, Chen continued, we learned to work together in ways we never had before. The old divisions, nation, religion, ideology, economic system, became irrelevant when faced with existential threat. We developed social structures based on collective survival and mutual support. Ambassador Thexnar understood now why the human ship had seemed so impossible. It wasn't built using advanced technology. It was built using adaptive technology, designed by a species that had learned to survive when survival should have been impossible. The entities left our system 19 years ago, Chen's voice continued. But they didn't abandon their purpose. They're still out there, in the dark between galaxies, converting matter and energy into structures we don't understand. And according to our long-range observations, they're moving toward the galactic core. The silence that followed was profound. Every representative in the chamber understood what this meant. The entities that had nearly destroyed humanity were coming for the Council species, and they would arrive with 47 years of additional preparation and evolution. This is why we came, Chen said. Not to threaten you or demand anything from you, but to warn you about what's coming and to offer what we've learned about how to survive it. Fleet Admiral Corksthal stood slowly, his battle-scarred form radiating the authority of someone who had never known defeat. But now he faced the possibility of a war that couldn't be won through superior firepower or tactical brilliance. What are you proposing? He asked. Alliance, Chen replied without hesitation. Not conquest, not absorption into human society, but genuine partnership between equals. We've learned how to survive what's coming, but we can't face it alone. And you have resources and capabilities that we need. What makes you think we need your help? demanded a representative from one of the Council's more militant species. Our technology is vastly superior to yours. Is it? Chen's question carried no mockery, only genuine curiosity. Your interdiction field couldn't stop our ship. Your most advanced sensors can't penetrate our hull configuration. Your communication systems can't prevent us from monitoring your discussions. Superior technology is meaningless if it's designed for the wrong kind of conflict. The truth of her words settled over the chamber like a weight. The humans had arrived in what should have been a primitive vessel, ignored the Council's most advanced defensive systems, and demonstrated capabilities that established science said were impossible. They had done it not through superior technology, but through superior adaptation. The entities will arrive in approximately 18 months, Chen continued. When they do, they'll encounter a galaxy full of species that have never faced true existential threat. They'll see civilizations built on hierarchy, technology designed for optimal conditions, and military forces trained to fight conventional enemies. She paused, letting the implications sink in. They'll see exactly what they saw when they first encountered us. Targets that will provide useful raw material for their unknown purpose. The only question is whether we'll face them as divided species competing for resources or as a united front with complementary capabilities. Chancellor Vexnari's implants hummed as she processed probability calculations. Our preliminary models suggest that conventional response to the threat described would result in significant losses. Define significant, Admiral Porkstall demanded. Complete extinction of all current galactic civilizations within a standard decade. The words fell into silence so complete that the ambient hum of the station's life support systems became audible. Every representative present understood the magnitude of what they were facing, not just another military conflict, but a challenge to the fundamental existence of organized life in the galaxy. However, Vexnari continued, models incorporating adaptive technologies and social structures similar to those developed by humanity suggest significantly improved survival probabilities. How significantly? Vexnar asked. Uncertain. The variables are beyond our current computational capabilities, but the improvement appears to be substantial. Commander Chen's voice cut through the chamber's silence. We're not asking you to abandon your societies or adopt our way of life. We're asking you to learn what we've learned. That survival isn't about being stronger than your enemy. It's about being too stubborn to die when death should be inevitable. The phrase struck every representative differently, but for all of them it carried the weight of truth. Looking at the data streams from the human ship, at the impossible vessel that had crossed impossible distances to deliver an impossible warning, they were seeing the embodiment of that philosophy. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. Chen quoted, her words carrying the weight of 47 years of loss, adaptation, and survival. We learned that lesson in the ruins of our first cities. We learned it again when half our species died fighting an enemy we couldn't defeat. And we learned it most completely when we realized that the only way to survive was to become something we had never been before. Part 3. The Alliance of the Unconquerable. 6 months after first contact, the transformation of galactic society had begun in ways that no one could have predicted. The great shipyards of the Korthak Empire worked alongside human engineers to develop vessels that combined advanced technology with adaptive design principles. Zenfari researchers collaborated with human scientists to create hybrid systems that could function under conditions that would cripple conventional equipment. And throughout Council space, species that had never worked as equals began learning the difficult art of genuine cooperation. Commander Chen stood on the observation deck of Kepler Station, watching as the first joint construction project took shape in the void. The vessel being assembled was unlike anything that had existed before, part Council technology, part human innovation, and entirely dedicated to the principle that survival mattered more than efficiency or elegance. The UES Resilience had been joined by 7 other human ships over the intervening months, each one a testament to humanity's hard-learned lessons about survival. But more importantly, it had been joined by vessels from 43 Council species, all committed to preparing for a threat that most of their populations still couldn't fully comprehend. The integration is proceeding faster than our most optimistic projections, reported Dr. Rakricha, Lethnar, who had become the Joint Project's chief coordinator. The combination of human adaptive engineering and Council advanced materials is producing capabilities that neither side could achieve alone. Chen nodded, but her attention was focused on something else entirely, The subtle changes in how the different species interacted with each other, the rigid hierarchies that had defined council society for millennia, were giving way to something more fluid, more based on demonstrated competence than inherited authority. "Sir," her communications officer called out, "we're receiving a priority transmission from deep space monitor stations." Multiple contacts detected at the galactic rim. The moment they had all been preparing for had arrived. Chen felt the familiar tightness in her stomach that came before battle, but also something else, a quiet confidence born from hard experience. They weren't the desperate refugees who had fled Earth 47 years ago. They had become something stronger. "All stations, this is Commander Chen. Activate the Joint Defense Protocols. Signal all Allied vessels to assume assigned positions." Across the system, the largest fleet in galactic history began moving into formation. Council ships that had been modified with human adaptive systems took positions alongside human vessels equipped with advanced Council technology. But more than the ships themselves, it was the crews that made the difference. Beings from dozens of species who had learned to work together not out of political necessity, but out of shared commitment to survival. Fleet Admiral Corkstal's voice cut across the communication channels, his tone carrying the authority of someone who had embraced a new understanding of warfare. "All ships, remember your training. We're not fighting to defeat an enemy. We're fighting to survive what cannot be defeated. Adaptation over destruction. Persistence over victory." The first reports from the monitor stations painted a picture that was both expected and terrifying. The entities had returned, but not as the relatively small force that had first encountered humanity. They came now as a vast array of converted matter, structures that spanned light years and moved with purpose that defied conventional understanding of physics. "Estimate of enemy force composition?" Chen asked. Her tactical officer, now assisted by Zentari analytical systems, paused before responding. "Unknown, sir. The entities appear to have evolved. They're demonstrating capabilities that don't match our previous encounter records." "How so?" "They're adapting in real time. Each structure that encounters our sensor sweeps immediately develops countermeasures. They're learning from us faster than we can learn from them." It was exactly what humanity had learned to expect from entities that operated on principles beyond organic comprehension. But it was also exactly what they had spent 47 years learning to counter. "Signal all vessels," Chen ordered. "Implement random rotation protocols. No predictable patterns, no standard responses. Make them adapt to chaos." The fleet that moved to meet the approaching entities bore no resemblance to any military force in galactic history. Ships changed formation constantly, using adaptive systems to reconfigure their capabilities mid-flight. Weapons systems that had been designed for specific purposes were jury-rigged on the fly to serve entirely different functions. And through it all, the crews worked with the fluid cooperation of beings who had learned that survival depended on absolute trust in each other's competence. The first engagement began not with the traditional exchange of long-range fire, but with something far more subtle. The entities attempted to analyze and categorize the approaching fleet, seeking to understand the threat they represented. What they encountered instead was a force that defied categorization, technology that shouldn't work but did, tactics that violated established military doctrine but achieved their objectives, and crews that responded to the impossible by finding new ways to make the impossible work. "Sir," the tactical officer reported, "the lead entity structures are showing signs of confusion. They're attempting multiple analysis protocols simultaneously." Chen smiled grimly. Confusion was exactly what they had hoped to achieve. The entity's greatest strength was their ability to understand and adapt to threats, but that same strength became a weakness when faced with adversaries who refused to behave predictably. "All ships implement Phase 2. Random individual action with coordinated objectives." What followed was a battle unlike any in recorded history. Instead of neat formations and coordinated attacks, the Allied fleet dissolved into apparent chaos. Individual ships pursued independent courses, using jury-rigged systems to accomplish objectives that seemed to change from moment to moment. But beneath the surface chaos was a deeper order, crews that had learned to work together so seamlessly that they could pursue complex strategies without formal communication or command structure. Ambassador Thexnar watched the engagement from the command center on Kepler Station, his crystalline structure vibrating with barely contained energy. His species had evolved to appreciate order and predictability, but what he was witnessing challenged every assumption about effective military action. How is this working? He asked Dr. Lefnar. They're violating every principle of tactical coordination. Are they? The xenobiologist replied. Or are they demonstrating a level of coordination that transcends formal tactical doctrine? On the main display, a Korthak heavy cruiser suddenly changed course, abandoning what appeared to be a successful attack run. But seconds later, 3 human vessels appeared in the space it had vacated, their combined firepower targeted at a vulnerable point in an entity structure that hadn't been visible until the cruiser's movement created the opening. They're not following a predetermined battle plan, Dr. Lefnar continued. They're responding to battlefield conditions in real time, each crew making decisions based on immediate assessment of tactical opportunities. That should result in complete chaos. It would if the crews didn't trust each other completely, but watch how they move. Each ship's crew knows that their counterparts will recognize and exploit any opportunities they create. The battle continued for 18 hours, neither side achieving decisive advantage. The entities demonstrated capabilities that exceeded even humanity's worst-case projections, converting Allied fire into defensive systems and adapting to tactical patterns almost instantly. But the Allied fleet continued to evolve its approach, finding new ways to exploit the entity's predictable response to threats. It was Commander Chen who recognized the crucial insight that changed everything. "They're not trying to defeat us," she announced over the general communication channel. "They're trying to understand us. Every adaptation, every response, they're gathering data about how we function." The realization struck home immediately. The entities weren't engaged in warfare as organic species understood it. They were conducting an analysis, seeking to categorize and comprehend the Allied forces so they could be properly integrated into whatever vast project the entities were pursuing. "All ships," Chen continued. "New tactical doctrine. Don't try to damage them, try to confuse them, make yourselves incomprehensible." What followed was perhaps the strangest battle in galactic history. Allied vessels began behaving in ways that defied not only military doctrine but basic logic. Ships flew backwards into combat zones. Weapon systems were used to create artistic patterns rather than inflict damage. Crews began broadcasting random data streams, poetry, mathematical equations, and fragments of philosophical discussions. The effect on the entities was immediate and profound. Structures that had been adapting smoothly to military threats began showing signs of instability. Analysis protocols that had operated flawlessly for millennia started producing contradictory results. And for the first time since they had arrived in the galaxy, the entities began to retreat. "Sir," the communications officer reported, "we're receiving a transmission, source unknown, but the signal pattern. It's coming from the entity structures." The message that emerged from the universal translator was unlike anything in the historical record of first contact. The voice was neither organic nor mechanical, but something else entirely. A form of communication that seemed to bypass normal sensory channels and speak directly to the mind. "Organic constructs, your function is unclear. Standard analysis protocols produce inconsistent results. Request clarification of purpose and method." For the first time in recorded history, the entities were asking questions. Commander Chen looked around her bridge, seeing the same mixture of amazement and wariness on every face. They had achieved something that should have been impossible, forcing beings of near godlike capability to acknowledge uncertainty about organic behavior. "This is Commander Sarah Chen of the Allied Fleet," she responded. "We are representatives of organic civilizations throughout this galaxy. Our purpose is survival through adaptation and cooperation. Our method is complicated." The response came immediately. Survival through adaptation is logical. Cooperation between distinct organic matrices is unprecedented in our analysis. Request demonstration of operational principles. Chen exchanged glances with her senior officers, seeing her own thoughts reflected in their expressions. The entities were offering to learn from them, an opportunity that could change the nature of the threat entirely. "We can provide demonstration," she replied carefully, "but it will require direct interaction between our representatives and your analytical systems. Are you prepared for such interaction?" The pause that followed stretched for nearly an hour, during which long-range sensors detected massive activity throughout the entity fleet. Structures were reconfiguring themselves, creating new formations that seemed designed for communication rather than analysis or conversion. "Demonstration acceptable. Designate representatives for direct interface." What happened next would be studied by xenobiologists and philosophers for generations. A small delegation of beings, human, Breldian, Xanthari, Korthak, and representatives from a dozen other species transferred to a specially configured shuttle and approached the nearest entity structure. The structure that received them defied description in conventional terms. It was simultaneously vast and intimate, alien and familiar, terrifying and beautiful. But more than its physical properties, it was the mind that inhabited it that challenged every assumption about consciousness and intelligence. The entity they encountered had existed for millions of years. Watching the rise and fall of countless civilizations, it had seen species achieve technological greatness only to destroy themselves through war, ecological collapse, or simple failure to adapt to changing conditions. It had catalogued thousands of different approaches to survival, but it had never encountered anything like what the allied species demonstrated. Your cooperation model produces outcomes that our predictive algorithms cannot account for. The entity communicated through direct mental interface. Individual units sacrifice optimal outcomes for collective benefit, yet collective outcomes exceed optimal predictions. Lethanar, serving as the delegation's scientific representative, found himself in the surreal position of explaining basic social cooperation to a being that had witnessed the death of stars. The key principle is that individual survival and collective survival are not competing priorities. They're complementary aspects of the same objective. This concept is foreign to our operational framework. Your operational framework is based on optimization and efficiency, added Chancellor Vexnari, her cybernetic implants somehow interfacing directly with the entity's analytical systems. Ours is based on resilience and adaptation. The entity's confusion was palpable, even through the alien interface. For millions of years, it had operated on the principle that survival required the most efficient use of available resources. Civilizations that failed to achieve optimal efficiency were converted into forms that could serve the greater purpose. But the allied species had achieved outcomes that exceeded optimal efficiency through methods that seemed to violate basic logical principles. Demonstrate, the entity requested. What followed was perhaps the most important lesson in galactic history. The delegation showed the entity how human society had evolved in response to repeated near-extinction events. They demonstrated the Vreldian principle of collective crystalline growth, where individual units contributed to structures stronger than their component parts. They explained the Xanthari concept of distributed consciousness, where individual intelligence combined to create capabilities beyond the sum of their parts. But most importantly, they showed how these different approaches could work together, creating hybrid systems that combined the strengths of multiple species while compensating for their individual weaknesses. Your species cooperate across biological and technological incompatibilities, the entity observed. This should produce system instabilities. It does, Chen admitted. Cooperation isn't efficient. It requires constant communication, compromise, and adaptation. But it produces something more valuable than efficiency: resilience. Explain resilience. The ability to survive when optimal conditions don't exist, Fleet Admiral Korkstall explained, his warrior's instincts helping him grasp concepts that pure logic couldn't encompass. The ability to continue functioning when everything goes wrong. The entity processed this information for several minutes, its vast analytical systems working to understand concepts that challenged its fundamental operational assumptions. Your survival methodology anticipates system failure. It requires system failure, Dr. Lethanar corrected. Our technology, our social structures, our military doctrines, they're all designed on the assumption that optimal conditions are temporary. We build for the worst-case scenario, not the best-case outcome. This is inefficient. Yes, Chen agreed. It's also unstoppable. The truth of her words hung in the alien environment like a challenge to the natural order of the universe. The entity had spent millions of years converting matter and energy into optimal configurations, creating structures of perfect efficiency designed to serve its incomprehensible purpose. But these organic beings had achieved something it hadn't considered possible. They had created systems that became stronger under stress, more capable when faced with impossible challenges. We have a proposition for you, Chen continued. Instead of converting our civilizations into components of your purpose, work with us to develop hybrid approaches. Combine your optimization capabilities with our adaptation strategies. For what objective? Survival of everything we've built. Your projects and our civilizations both. The entity's response came after the longest pause yet. Your proposition suggests mutual benefit without hierarchical integration. This concept requires further analysis. Take all the time you need, Chen replied. But consider this. We've shown you something that your analysis systems couldn't predict or understand. Doesn't that suggest that our approach might have value for achieving objectives that pure optimization can't accomplish? Over the following days, something unprecedented occurred. The entity fleet halted its advance and began what could only be described as intensive consultation. Structures that had been configured for analysis and conversion were reconfigured for communication and computation. And throughout the entity network, beings that had operated on unchanging principles for millions of years began questioning fundamental assumptions about survival, efficiency. A breakthrough came when the entities made an announcement that would reshape the galaxy. We have identified a threat that requires capabilities beyond our current operational parameters. Long-range sensors detected what the entities were referring to. Structures approaching from outside the local galactic group. Constructs that made even the entity's vast ships seem insignificant by comparison. Something was coming that dwarfed both organic civilization and the entities themselves. We propose alliance, the entity continued. Integration of optimization and adaptation methodologies to develop hybrid capabilities sufficient for survival of all constituent elements. Commander Chen smiled as she prepared humanity's response. 47 years ago, they had been a single species facing impossible odds. Now they were part of an alliance that spanned not only the galaxy's organic civilizations, but entities whose capabilities bordered on godlike. Alliance accepted, she replied. Let's build something impossible together. The work that followed would define the future of intelligence in the galaxy. Human adaptive engineering combined with entity optimization capabilities produced technologies that neither side could have developed alone. Council species contributed insights from dozens of different evolutionary paths, creating hybrid solutions that drew strength from biological diversity and technological innovation. Most importantly, the alliance developed something that no single civilization had ever achieved. Genuine unity of purpose without loss of individual identity. Each species, each entity, each individual consciousness contributed their unique capabilities to collective objectives while maintaining their own values and perspectives. The structures they built together defied every conventional understanding of engineering, architecture, and social organization. Ships that grew stronger under attack. Colonies that could survive the death of their host stars. Communication networks that became more efficient as they expanded across impossible distances. But perhaps their greatest achievement was the development of what they termed adaptive consciousness, forms of intelligence that could function across the vast range of scales from individual organic minds to entity-level distributed awareness. These hybrid consciousnesses could think like humans when facing problems that required intuition and creativity, like entities when dealing with optimization and analysis, and like something entirely new when confronting challenges that neither approach could handle alone. When the external threat finally arrived, constructs from dying galaxies seeking to harvest the resources necessary for their own survival, they encountered something that had never existed before in the history of the universe. Not a single species, not even a single type of intelligence, but a truly universal alliance that combined every possible approach to the problem of existence. The battle that followed lasted for centuries, spanning star systems and involving technologies that restructured matter at the quantum level. But throughout it all, the alliance held together, each component contributing their unique strengths while adapting to support their partner's weaknesses. They didn't just survive the external threat, they transformed it. The attacking constructs, faced with something they had never encountered before, were offered the same choice that had been given to the entities: integration or cooperation. Some chose integration, becoming part of the ever-growing alliance. Others chose cooperation, maintaining their independence while contributing to collective objectives. In the end, what emerged from the conflict was something that no science fiction writer had ever imagined: a form of civilization that spanned multiple galaxies, incorporated every possible form of intelligence, and was dedicated to the principle that survival was not a zero-sum game. Commander Sarah Chen, now ancient by human standards but kept alive by technologies that combined organic adaptation with entity optimization, stood on the observation deck of a station that orbited a star born from the controlled collapse of an entire star cluster. Around her, beings that had once been enemies worked together to create marvels that would have been considered impossible just centuries before. "Status report?" she asked her aide. a hybrid consciousness that combined human intuition, Zen theory analytical capability, and entity optimization protocols. All systems functioning within acceptable parameters, came the response. The next wave of exploration vessels is ready for deployment to the Andromeda Group. The Terraform project in the Magellanic Clouds is ahead of schedule, and the first generation of truly universal consciousnesses has begun to emerge from the hybrid development programs. Chen nodded, feeling the satisfaction that came from seeing impossible dreams made real. They had started as a single species facing extinction, had become an alliance of the desperate, and had ultimately evolved into something that could face any challenge the universe might present. Any problems that require attention? Nothing that can't be handled through adaptive protocols, the aide replied, though the philosophers are still debating whether what we've become can still be called human or organic or artificial. Chen smiled. What do you think? I think those categories stopped being relevant about the time we learned that survival isn't about being strong enough to win, but about being stubborn enough to keep adapting when winning becomes impossible. She looked out at the impossible vista beyond the station's transparent barriers, galaxies linked by structures of living metal and crystallized thought, stars guided by consciousnesses that spanned light years, worlds where beings of 1,000 different species worked together to create forms of beauty and functionality that no single imagination could have conceived. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, she murmured, repeating the phrase that had become the unofficial motto of the Alliance. Her aide registered the quotation and provided context. The principle has proven remarkably robust across multiple species and intelligence types. Analysis suggests it may be a fundamental law of complex systems evolution. Chen laughed, a sound that carried both human warmth and harmonic frequencies that her enhanced physiology had learned to produce for the benefit of non-human listeners. Or maybe it's just what happens when you refuse to give up, even when giving up is the only logical option. She turned away from the observation window and walked toward her next meeting, where representatives from 17 different types of consciousness would gather to plan the next phase of expansion into previously uncharted regions of space. There were challenges ahead that no one could predict, threats that they couldn't imagine, and problems that would require the development of entirely new forms of existence. It was exactly the kind of impossible situation that they had learned to thrive in. The Alliance had become something that no single species could have achieved alone, not because they were stronger or smarter or more advanced than any individual civilization, but because they had learned the most fundamental truth about survival in an universe that cared nothing for the ambitions or fears of any particular form of intelligence. The future belonged not to the strongest or the smartest or the most technologically advanced, but to those who could adapt, cooperate, and continue growing, even when growth should have been impossible. It belonged to those who had learned to destroy their weak selves not through conquest or absorption, but through transformation into something greater than they had ever imagined possible. The legend of humanity, the species that had somehow survived what should have killed them, crossed impossible distances in primitive ships, and convinced the galaxy's greatest powers to work together, had become reality. But more than that, it had become the foundation for something even more legendary. A form of civilization that could face any challenge, overcome any obstacle, and continue growing toward possibilities that no single imagination could encompass. In the end, they had proven that the universe's greatest challenges were not problems to be solved, but opportunities to become something better than they had been before. And in a cosmos full of impossible things, that might have been the most impossible achievement of all.